Hey there, tonight we're talking about something rarely discussed with real honesty: medieval motherhood. Not the sanitized version you might find in period dramas or romantic histories, but the actual lived experience of women who bore and raised children in a world that was simultaneously brutal and tender, dangerous and deeply human. Before we begin, if you enjoy these quiet explorations of the past, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us on these late-night journeys through history. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let's step back into a world where motherhood was not a choice, but an expectation, and where every woman who survived childbirth carried stories that would make modern mothers weep. The first thing you need to understand about being a medieval mother is that you probably didn't choose it. Not really. Marriage was rarely about love, especially if you came from a family with any property or status worth protecting. From the moment you were old enough to understand the world around you, you understood that your body belonged to someone else's plans. If you were noble, those plans were political. Your marriage would seal alliances, transfer land, or end feuds. If you were a peasant, those plans were practical. Your marriage would combine labor, pool resources, and ensure survival. Either way, your own desires mattered very little. The church taught that women had two acceptable paths. You could become a nun, dedicating your life to celibacy and prayer. Or you could become a wife and mother, using your body to produce the next generation. There was no third option. Even the language used to describe these choices revealed how limited they were. A woman who chose the convent was praised for escaping the curse of Eve. A woman who chose marriage was reminded constantly that her suffering in childbirth was penance for that original sin. You couldn't win. One path meant denying your body entirely. The other meant surrendering it to pain, danger, and the endless cycle of pregnancy and birth. For most women, marriage came early. Canon law set the minimum age at 12 for girls and 14 for boys, though in practice, noble families often betrothed children even younger. A girl of 7 might find herself promised to a man she never met, her future decided over negotiations about dowries and land rights. Among the nobility, these child marriages were shockingly common. The families didn't wait because they were cruel. They waited because power was unstable, alliances shifted, and death came for everyone eventually. Securing your daughter's future meant securing it early, before circumstances changed or better offers disappeared. But here's what the history books often skip over. Those betrothals, made when children were barely old enough to understand what marriage meant, weren't supposed to be consummated until the girl reached 14. That was the age when church and society agreed a girl's body could handle pregnancy. Even medieval people, living in a world we'd consider primitive, recognized that pregnancy at too young an age was dangerous. They didn't have our medical terminology, but they knew what happened when girls who weren't fully grown tried to carry children. They knew about the deaths, the torn bodies, the babies who didn't survive. And yet, despite this knowledge, girls still married young. Not as young as the legal minimum might suggest, but young enough that their teenage years were defined by pregnancy, childbirth, and the care of infants. Among the peasantry, marriage patterns looked different. Common women typically married in their late teens or early 20s, after years spent working as servants or laborers, saving what little they could. There was less pressure to marry strategically because there was less to strategically protect. A peasant marriage united two people who would work together, share a household, and hopefully produce children who could contribute to the family's survival. Love wasn't the point, though it sometimes developed. Survival was the point. And in that sense, peasant marriages were more honest. No one pretended you were marrying for romance. You married because you needed a partner, because the work was too much for one person alone, and because children meant labor and security in your old age. Whether you were noble or common, once you married, your role was clear. You were expected to become pregnant as soon as possible. For noble families, This was about producing heirs. Your husband's lineage needed to continue. His land needed someone to inherit it. Your value as a wife was measured in your ability to deliver healthy children, preferably sons. If you failed, if you remained barren or produced only daughters, you could be set aside, divorced, or blamed. History is full of queens who lost their positions because they couldn't produce male heirs. Catherine of Aragon's tragedy wasn't unique. It was simply the most famous example of a pattern that repeated across centuries. For common women, pregnancy meant something different but equally important. Children were workers. They helped in the fields, tended animals, carried water, gathered fuel, and performed dozens of tasks that kept a household functioning. A woman who couldn't have children was seen as a burden rather than an asset. Her inability to contribute the next generation meant her marriage had failed its primary purpose. This wasn't just social pressure. It was economic reality. In a world without pensions, social security, or retirement funds, your children were your future. They would care for you when you grew old, support you if you became ill, and carry on your family's name and work after you died. So you got pregnant. Maybe you wanted to. Maybe you didn't. It didn't particularly matter. And here's where medieval motherhood reveals its first terrible truth. You might not even know you were pregnant for months. Without modern pregnancy tests, women relied on the cessation of their monthly bleeding and eventually, the first flutter of movement inside their womb. This moment, called the quickening, usually occurred around 5 months into pregnancy. It was only then, feeling that tiny kick against your insides, that you knew for certain a child was growing within you. Until that moment, you lived with uncertainty. Was your bleeding late because you were pregnant, or because you were ill, or simply because women's bodies were unpredictable? You couldn't know. You could only wait and wonder. Once the quickening confirmed your pregnancy, everything changed. If you were wealthy, preparations began immediately. Chambers were readied, midwives were consulted, and religious objects were gathered to protect you through the ordeal ahead. If you were poor, you simply kept working. Pregnancy didn't excuse you from labor. Fields still needed tending. Animals still needed feeding. Water still needed carrying. Your body swelled and ached, your back screamed in protest, and you kept going because stopping wasn't an option. There was no maternity leave in medieval Europe. There was only work, and more work, until labor began and you were forced to stop. The medical advice available to pregnant women was a strange mixture of practical wisdom and complete nonsense. Texts recommended specific diets, usually emphasizing roasted and fragrant foods. Women were told to avoid stress, get adequate rest, and regulate their exercise. These recommendations sound reasonable until you remember that most women had no ability to follow them. How could a peasant woman reduce her stress when survival itself was stressful? How could she rest when her family's livelihood depended on her labor? The gap between medical advice and lived reality was enormous. Wealthy women might afford the luxury of following these guidelines. Common women simply endured. Then there were the superstitions. Medieval people believed that what a pregnant woman saw or experienced could mark her unborn child. If she looked at something ugly, her baby might be born ugly. If she gazed at animals, her child might take on animal characteristics. This belief, called maternal impression, was taken seriously. Pregnant women were warned to control where they looked, to avoid frightening or disturbing sights, to surround themselves with beauty and calm. One physician claimed a woman gave birth to a hairy child because she looked at an image of John the Baptist clothed in animal skins during conception. Another story told of a two-headed beggar being banned from a town because authorities feared her presence might cause pregnant women to give birth to two-headed babies. These tales sound absurd to modern ears, but they reveal something important. Medieval people were desperate to explain birth defects and abnormalities, and in the absence of genetic science, they blamed whatever seemed different or wrong about the mother's experience during pregnancy. Food cravings were taken seriously, though. Medical wisdom held that pregnant women must satisfy their cravings, no matter how strange, or risk having babies born without vital organs or marked with birthmarks. This advice actually gave women some power. If you craved expensive foods or rare delicacies, your husband was expected to provide them. It was one of the few times a woman's desires took precedence over practical concerns. Though interestingly, there was one exception. If you craved a hare's head, you were supposed to resist at all costs. Eating one, they believed, would cause your child to be born with a cleft lip. The logic behind these beliefs was convoluted, but the underlying anxiety was universal. Every mother wanted her child to be born healthy, whole, and perfect. In the absence of prenatal care or any real understanding of fetal development, superstition filled the gap. As your pregnancy progressed, the reality of what was coming loomed larger. Childbirth in the Middle Ages was extraordinarily dangerous. The numbers are staggering and heartbreaking. Modern historians estimate that somewhere between 30 and 60% of women and infants died during or shortly after birth. Think about that for a moment. That means roughly 1 in 3 births ended in death for either the mother, the baby, or both. These weren't isolated tragedies. They were the normal, expected toll of bringing children into the world. Every medieval woman who became pregnant knew she might not survive it. Every woman who went into labor understood she might be saying goodbye to her family forever. This knowledge shaped everything. Pregnant women wrote their wills before giving birth. They made arrangements for their other children, settled their affairs, and said goodbye to their loved ones just in case. This wasn't paranoia. It was practical planning. 1 in 3 women died during their childbearing years, not necessarily from a single catastrophic birth, but from the accumulated trauma of multiple pregnancies and deliveries. Your first birth might go well. Your second might leave you weakened. Your third, fourth, or fifth might kill you. The danger was cumulative and unavoidable. When labor began, you entered a space that was exclusively female. Men, including your husband and even male physicians, were forbidden from entering the birthing chamber. The only exception was if something went so catastrophically wrong that a male surgeon needed to be called in, usually to save the baby if the mother was already dead or dying. Otherwise, birth was women's business. Your mother might attend if she was alive. Your female relatives and neighbors would gather. And most importantly, the midwife would arrive. Midwives were the backbone of medieval childbirth. These were women who had learned their craft through experience, often by assisting other midwives for years before taking on cases of their own. They carried knowledge passed down through generations. How to position a laboring woman for easier delivery. How to turn a baby that was positioned wrong. How to slow or speed labor when necessary. What herbs might ease pain or stop bleeding. This knowledge was practical, hard-won, and often effective. Midwives saved countless lives, though history rarely remembers their names. But here's what made a midwife's position unique and sometimes dangerous. The church required midwives to take oaths promising they wouldn't use anything from the birth for witchcraft. The umbilical cord, the afterbirth, even the call if a baby was born with one, these were all considered potentially powerful objects in magical practices. By making midwives swear not to keep or use these items, the church was acknowledging both the sacred nature of birth and the fear of women's power over life and death. A midwife stood at that threshold. She brought children into the world, and sometimes, despite her best efforts, she watched them and their mothers leave it. The birthing chamber itself was deliberately constructed to be womb-like. Windows were covered with heavy cloths to block out light. Tapestries were hung on the walls, chosen for their calming imagery. Crucifixes and holy relics were placed around the room. The goal was to create a warm, dark, quiet space that mimicked the womb the baby was leaving. Only one small window remained open to allow fresh air in, as too much light was believed to damage the mother's eyes during labor. In this dim, enclosed space, surrounded only by women, you would labor for hours or days. The pain was extraordinary, and there was almost nothing to relieve it. No epidurals. No pain medication in any modern sense. What you had were birthing girdles, long pieces of parchment covered in prayers and religious symbols, which you wrapped around your swollen belly. Chemical analysis of surviving girdles has found traces of cervicovaginal fluid, honey, milk, eggs, and plant materials, all substances medieval texts recommended for childbirth. These girdles weren't just symbolic. Women genuinely believed they offered protection, and perhaps the belief itself provided some small comfort in the midst of overwhelming pain. You also had prayer. Women called on Saint Margaret, the patron saint of pregnancy and childbirth. They invoked the Virgin Mary, who had experienced birth herself and was therefore thought to understand what laboring women endured. Religious charms and prayers were recited constantly. Some women clutched pieces of tin or butter inscribed with protective words. Others held ember or coral amulets. The Church approved of these practices as long as they called on God and divine intervention rather than on pagan or magical forces. The line between acceptable religious practice and forbidden magic was thin and carefully policed. Various remedies were applied during labor. Rubbing the mother's hips and private areas with violet or rose oil. Giving her pepper to make her sneeze, supposedly helping to expel the baby. Tying a snakeskin around her hips. Using substances whose origins we can only guess at now. Some of these treatments might have provided actual physical relief through massage or herbal properties. Others were pure superstition. But in the midst of labor, when pain was tearing through your body in waves and your life hung in precarious balance, you would try anything. The actual delivery could take many forms. Some women used birthing stools, sitting upright while gravity helped move the baby down. Others were held from behind by attendants, supported under their arms while they pushed. Some labored in bed, though this was generally considered less effective. The midwife's expertise was crucial. She watched for complications. If the baby was breech, coming feet or buttocks first rather than head first, the midwife would try to turn it. If labor stalled, she had techniques to restart it. If bleeding became excessive, she knew how to try to stop it. Sometimes her interventions worked. Sometimes they didn't. When complications arose that the midwife couldn't handle, a barber surgeon might be called in. These were men who performed basic surgical procedures, including emergency interventions during birth. But their arrival often meant the situation was already catastrophic. Caesarean sections existed but were only performed if the mother was already dead or dying, and the goal was to save the baby. There was no anesthesia, no understanding of sterile technique, no antibiotics for the inevitable infections. Surgical intervention during medieval childbirth usually meant choosing which life to prioritize when saving both was impossible. If you survived delivery, the immediate danger wasn't over. Postpartum hemorrhage killed many women in the hours after giving birth. The placenta had to be delivered completely, or infection would set in. Your body, exhausted and traumatized, had to recover from an ordeal that had pushed it to its absolute limits. For the first several days, you remained in the birthing chamber, resting, being cared for by the women who had attended you, and bonding with your new baby if both of you had survived. But survival brought its own complications. The biggest killer of new mothers was puerperal fever, an infection of the uterus caused by unsanitary conditions during and after delivery. In an age before anyone understood germ theory or the importance of hand washing, infections spread easily. Midwives and attendants moved from one birth to another, inadvertently carrying bacteria on their unwashed hands. Women with even minor tears or trauma during delivery were vulnerable to infection. Once it took hold, puerperal fever was usually fatal. You would develop a fever, experience worsening pain, and slowly deteriorate over days or weeks as the infection consumed you from within. If you made it through childbirth and the immediate postpartum period without infection, you still faced the medieval church's judgment about the process. Birth was considered unclean. The pain and blood and bodily fluids made it a polluted event in the church's view. tainted by the original sin that had caused women to suffer in childbirth in the first place. For 40 days after giving birth, you were forbidden from entering a church. You couldn't receive communion. You couldn't participate in religious services. You were literally considered too impure to worship. At the end of those 40 days, you underwent churching, a ceremony of purification that allowed you back into the church community. You attended Mass carrying a candle, publicly marking your return to religious life. This ritual was taken so seriously that even the Virgin Mary herself, despite the supposedly immaculate nature of her pregnancy, was subject to churching. The Feast of Candlemas, celebrated 40 days after Christmas, commemorated Mary's churching. If the Mother of God required purification after childbirth, every other woman certainly did. But let's say you survived all of this. You survived pregnancy. You survived labor. You survived the infections and complications of recovery. You were churched and welcomed back into society. Now came the next challenge, that being a mother. If you were wealthy, you might not nurse your own child. Wet nurses, women hired to breastfeed babies who weren't their own, were common in noble households. There were practical reasons for this. Breastfeeding acts as a natural contraceptive, delaying the return of fertility. For royal and noble families desperate to produce multiple heirs, this was a problem. By hiring a wet nurse, a wealthy woman could become pregnant again more quickly, increasing her chances of providing the spare heirs that aristocratic succession required. Additionally, breastfeeding was seen as beneath the dignity of high-status women. It was physically demanding, tied you to the baby's feeding schedule, and prevented you from fulfilling your social and political obligations as a noble wife. Wet nurses were often well paid, sometimes earning 3 times what a regular servant made. But their work was emotionally complicated. The woman you hired to nurse your child was often a mother herself. She had either weaned her own baby early to take the job, lost the child and had milk but no one to feed, or in the cruelest cases, been enslaved and separated from her own infant forever. The business of wet nursing was built on the bodies and losses of poor women. And medieval people were deeply anxious about wet nurses. They believed that a child absorbed the nurse's characteristics through her milk. If the nurse was foolish, your child might become foolish. If she was of poor moral character, those flaws would transfer to your baby through nursing. Medical texts went into exhaustive detail about how to select a proper wet nurse. She should be healthy, of good moral standing, calm in temperament, and ideally from a similar social class to the family. Her diet mattered. Her emotions mattered. Everything about her was scrutinized because medieval people believed that milk wasn't just nutrition. It was a vessel for personality, intelligence, and moral character. This belief made wet nursing fraught with anxiety. Wealthy families constantly worried about choosing the wrong woman. They monitored their wet nurses obsessively, controlling what they ate, where they went, and how they behaved. Some contracts specified that wet nurses had to live in the employer's household, under constant supervision. Others required regular check-ins and inspections. The fear wasn't just that the wet nurse would fail to feed the baby properly. It was that she would, through her milk, fundamentally alter who the child would become. For common women, wet nursing wasn't an option. You breastfed your own children, period. Not because it was morally superior, though the church certainly preached that it was, but because you couldn't afford to do anything else. Medieval babies typically nursed for a remarkably long time by modern standards, often until they were 2 or even 3 years old. This extended nursing served multiple purposes. Breast milk was safe, unlike water or animal milk, which could carry disease. It provided complete nutrition for infants who couldn't yet digest solid foods. And it spaced out pregnancies naturally, giving your body time to recover between births. But nursing was exhausting. A baby needed to feed every few hours, day and night, for months on end. If you were a peasant mother, you were nursing while also working in the fields, tending your home, cooking meals, and managing all the other endless tasks that kept your family alive. You learned to feed the baby while doing other work, carrying the infant in a sling or wrap that kept them close to your breast while your hands remained free. There was no such thing as a break from mothering. It was continuous, relentless, and expected. When it came time to wean the baby, the process was often harsh by modern standards. One common method was to spread bitter substances like mustard or aloe on your nipples, making breastfeeding unpleasant enough that the baby would refuse it. Another was simply to separate the child from you for several days, sending them to stay with relatives until they forgot about nursing. These methods sound cruel, but in a world where another pregnancy was expected soon, weaning had to be decisive. There was no room for the gradual, gentle weaning that modern parenting advice recommends. And then there was the shadow that hung over every medieval mother. The near certainty that you would lose at least one child. Infant and child mortality in the Middle Ages was catastrophic. The numbers varied by region and time period, but historians estimate that roughly 25% of babies died in their first year. That's 1 in 4. Another 12% died between ages 1 and 4. 6% more died between 5 and 9. Do the math, and you realize that nearly half of all children born in medieval Europe didn't survive to age 10. Half. That means every family, every mother, expected to bury children. It wasn't a tragic exception. It was the norm. King Edward I and his wife Eleanor of Castile had 16 children together. 11 daughters and 5 sons. Of those 16 children, only 6 lived to adulthood. Their son John died at age 5. Henry died at 6. Alfonso lived to 11. Only Edward, their youngest son born in 1284, survived to inherit the kingdom. Of their 11 daughters, 6 died before age 3. This was a royal family with access to the best food, the finest medical care, and the most comfortable living conditions medieval Europe could offer. And still, they lost 10 children. Catherine of Siena's mother had at least 23 children. 8 survived to adulthood. Imagine that. 23 pregnancies. 23 labors. 23 babies placed in your arms. And 15 deaths. 15 small graves. 15 griefs that never quite healed. For common families, the losses were probably worse. Malnutrition made children vulnerable to disease. Crowded living conditions spread illness quickly. Accidents around the home and farm killed children with appalling regularity. Boys drowned in wells and rivers. Girls fell into fires while helping with cooking. Babies suffocated when sleeping in their parents' beds, though whether this was truly accidental or sometimes a form of desperate birth control is a question historians still debate. Medieval miracle stories, accounts of saints supposedly intervening to save dying children, give us glimpses of maternal grief that are almost unbearable to read. In one story, a 5-year-old girl helping her father slaughter a pig was told to wash her hands in a pool of water. She slipped, fell in, and drowned. When her mother learned what happened, she ran outside, wept in front of the gathered crowd, and cried out to Thomas Becket to revive her daughter. "Return my daughter to me, Martyr Thomas," she sobbed. "If anyone is the cause of this accident, it is me, her mother alone that must bear the blame for the crime, for it is I who did not send someone to supervise her from the dangers of childhood. I should have sent someone to watch over her." The guilt in that mother's voice echoes across centuries. She blamed herself entirely, even though the accident had been her husband's doing. He was the one who told the child to wash her hands. He was the one who failed to watch her. But the mother took all the blame, publicly declaring her negligence in front of her community, begging a dead saint to undo what her supposed failure had caused. The story says the girl was miraculously revived. But even if that's true, the grief and guilt the mother expressed in that moment were real. They were raw. And they were shared by countless other mothers who lost children to accidents, disease, and simple bad luck. Another miracle story tells of a woman named Olivia who found her child dead. She grieved so loudly that neighbors came running. The author of the Miracle account explicitly states that Olivia's excessive grief came from guilt, from knowing she had failed in her most basic parental duties. At one point, she tried to run away from the death scene because she couldn't bear facing what her negligence had supposedly caused. The author uses this story to warn other mothers to properly swaddle their children or risk similar tragedy. These stories reveal something important about how medieval society viewed motherhood. Mothers were held responsible for their children's safety in ways that fathers weren't. When a child died in an accident, even one the father had caused, the mother's grief was examined for signs of guilt. She was expected to blame herself, to publicly confess her failures, and to bear the emotional weight of loss. Maternal love was acknowledged and even celebrated, but it was also weaponized. If you loved your child properly, you would have prevented their death. If your child died, it meant your love or your vigilance had been insufficient. And yet, despite everything medieval mothers endured, despite the danger and the loss and the unrelenting difficulty of their lives, they loved their children. History preserves countless examples of this love. Toys survived from the medieval period, simple wooden animals and dolls lovingly carved for children to play with. Walking frames helped toddlers learn to stand. Cradles were crafted and decorated. Parents commissioned artwork showing themselves with their children. Wills carefully divided possessions among surviving children, ensuring each was provided for. The old historical theory that medieval people didn't emotionally invest in their children because infant mortality was so high has been thoroughly disproven. Parents didn't love their children less because they might lose them. They loved them desperately, and when loss came, they grieved with a depth that shows across centuries in letters, chronicles, and accounts of their lives. Margaret of Anjou, forced to flee England during political turmoil, gave birth to a stillborn baby while at sea off Calais. The trauma of that loss, combined with the danger and stress of her circumstances, is almost unimaginable. Margaret Beaufort gave birth to her only child, the future Henry VII, when she was just 13 years old. The labor was so difficult and traumatic that she never had another child, despite marrying multiple times afterward. But she didn't abandon or resent the son whose birth had damaged her body so severely. She devoted her life to him, fighting politically to secure his future, and became one of the most powerful women in England. That's maternal love, fierce and unbreakable, even when motherhood itself was forced on a child too young to bear it. As a medieval mother, your daily life was consumed by work. If you were a peasant, you labored in the fields alongside your husband, planting and harvesting crops while simultaneously managing your household. You cooked every meal from scratch, hauling water from wells, slaughtering animals, preserving food for winter, grinding grain into flour, and baking bread. You spun wool into thread, wove thread into cloth, and sewed cloth into clothing for your entire family. You maintained your home, such as it was, sweeping dirt floors, tending the fire that provided heat and light, and trying to keep your family from freezing or starving. And you did all of this while pregnant or nursing, usually with small children clinging to you or following at your heels. Medieval childhood came with expectations of work from an early age. By 5 or 6, children were assigned tasks: fetching water, gathering firewood, scaring birds from fields, feeding chickens, and helping with whatever their small hands could manage. But someone still had to supervise them, teach them, comfort them when they were frightened or hurt, and that someone was you. There was no separation between work and childcare. You did both simultaneously, constantly, until your body gave out or death came for you. Noble women had different challenges. You didn't labor in fields, but you ran an entire household, which was itself a massive enterprise. Managing servants, overseeing food production and storage, handling accounts, ensuring the household ran smoothly while your husband was away, these were your responsibilities. You were also expected to be politically astute, capable of managing your lord's estates in his absence, defending his interests at court, and sometimes even commanding his forces if war came to your door. Medieval noblewomen were often formidable managers and politicians. Their education prepared them for these roles, though it was always understood that their primary value lay in producing legitimate heirs. Whether common or noble, once you survived your first birth, the cycle started again. Medieval women who lived through childbearing age often had many pregnancies. Not because they wanted endless children, but because birth control was essentially non-existent or ineffective, and the rhythm of pregnancy and nursing determined your fertility. Once you weaned a child, your fertility returned, and you were likely to become pregnant again within months. The cycle repeated until menopause, death, or your body simply couldn't sustain another pregnancy. Some women gave birth to a dozen or more children over their lifetime. Some had far fewer, either because they weren't as fertile, because they lost pregnancies to miscarriage, or because they didn't survive long enough to have more. But the expectation was always the same. Your body existed to produce children. Your role as a wife centered on fertility. Your value as a woman was measured in babies born and, crucially, babies who survived to adulthood. This constant pressure, physical and social, wore women down. Your body never fully recovered from one pregnancy before the next one began. Childbirth injuries accumulated. Tears in the pelvic floor from difficult deliveries caused chronic pain and incontinence. Prolapsed uteruses were common and agonizing. Hemorrhoids, varicose veins, tooth loss from calcium deficiency, all of these were accepted as normal consequences of repeated pregnancy and birth. By your 30s, if you lived that long, you might be physically broken, your body used up by the endless cycle of growing and delivering children. And through it all, you kept working. There was no rest. No recovery period that lasted more than a few days after each birth. No recognition that your body needed time to heal. The household needed managing. The fields needed tending. The children needed feeding. You got up, and you kept going, because stopping meant your family might not survive. Medieval motherhood was also shaped by religious judgment. The Church taught that women's suffering in childbirth was God's punishment for Eve's sin. Your pain was deserved. It was cosmic justice for the weakness of the first woman. This belief didn't make the pain easier to bear. It just added shame and guilt to the physical agony. You weren't just suffering. You were being punished, and everyone agreed you deserved it. The Church also controlled your sex life in ways that seem absurd now. You couldn't have intercourse on Sundays, Thursdays, or Fridays. You couldn't have sex during Lent, Advent, or on any feast days. You couldn't have sex during your menstrual period, which was considered unclean. You were supposed to abstain during pregnancy, though many couples ignored this rule. You had to abstain during breastfeeding, which again, often didn't happen. And you were supposed to abstain for 40 days after giving birth. Add up all these prohibited times, and the average married couple was theoretically allowed to have sex less than once a week. Of course, people broke these rules constantly. But the guilt and anxiety the rules created were real. If your child was born deformed or died young, it might be because you'd had sex on a forbidden day. If you suffered during childbirth, it might be punishment for breaking the Church's sexual regulations. Every natural disaster, every misfortune, could be traced back to sexual sin, either yours personally or humanity's collective guilt. This religious framework also meant that women had almost no control over their fertility. The Church forbade contraception and abortion as grave sins. Even attempting to prevent pregnancy was considered a form of murder, killing the potential souls that might have been. If you were desperate to stop having children, if your body couldn't take another pregnancy, if you already had more mouths to feed than you could manage, too bad. Your duty was to accept whatever pregnancies came, no matter the cost to your health or your family's survival. There were underground methods, of course. Herbal preparations that supposedly prevented conception or induced menstruation. Folk remedies passed quietly between women. But using them meant risking your soul and, if you were caught, potentially your life. Women accused of using contraception or trying to abort pregnancies could be charged with witchcraft or murder. The punishment was severe, not just legal but social. You would be marked as an unnatural woman, someone who had rejected God's plan and tried to thwart divine will. So most women simply endured. They had baby after baby until their bodies gave out, or until menopause brought merciful relief. The toll this took on women's bodies, minds, and spirits is something we can barely comprehend now. Modern women who choose to have multiple children do so with prenatal care, pain relief, medical intervention when needed, and time between pregnancies to recover. Medieval women had none of that. They had only endurance, prayer, and the hope that maybe this time, both they and the baby would survive. But here's what often gets lost when we talk about how brutal medieval motherhood was. These women weren't passive victims. They found ways to survive, to love their children fiercely, and to create moments of joy in the midst of hardship. They sang lullabies to their babies, the same melodies repeated across generations. They told stories. They played simple games. They celebrated their children's milestones, first words and first steps and first days, helping with real work. Medieval mothers also built networks of support that modern historians are only beginning to fully appreciate. Women helped each other through childbirth, sharing knowledge and labor. Neighbors stepped in when a new mother was recovering, or when illness struck a household. Grandmothers, if they lived long enough to see their grandchildren, provided childcare and wisdom. The image of the isolated medieval housewife suffering alone is false. Women created communities of care that helped them survive. And they fought for their children in ways that required tremendous courage. Mothers whose babies were sickly sought out healers, even when doing so risked accusations of witchcraft. They used whatever resources they had to feed their children during famines, sometimes going hungry themselves. They taught their daughters skills that would help them survive as women in a brutal world. They prepared their sons for whatever future awaited them. In a world that gave women almost no power, motherhood was one arena where women's actions mattered absolutely. Medieval mothers also negotiated with religious authorities on behalf of their children. If a baby died unbaptized, its soul was supposedly condemned to limbo, either heaven nor hell. Mothers begged priests to baptize dying infants, and miracle stories tell of desperate women running to shrines carrying their dead children, praying for just enough life to return for the baptism to happen. The child would revive, be baptized, and then die again, their souls saved. Whether these stories were true doesn't matter as much as what they reveal about maternal devotion and desperation. As medieval mothers raised their children past infancy, the challenges shifted but never lessened. Teaching was one of your primary responsibilities, especially if you had daughters. In a world where formal education was largely unavailable to women, mothers became the main teachers. You taught your daughters the skills they need to survive as wives and mothers themselves. How to spin wool and weave cloth. How to cook and preserve food. How to manage a household's resources. How to tend the sick. How to navigate the complex social expectations that governed women's lives. For wealthy mothers, education might include teaching daughters to read, usually starting with devotional texts like books of hours or psalters. Visual evidence from medieval art shows Saint and teaching the Virgin Mary to read, a scene repeated frequently enough that historians believe it reflected actual practice. Mothers who were literate passed that skill to their daughters through prayer books and religious texts. Learning to read was connected to piety, making it more acceptable for girls than purely secular education. Some noble mothers provided extensive education for their daughters. Queen Isabella of Castile, Catherine of Aragon's mother, ensured her daughters received classical educations that rivaled those of male princes. Catherine studied Latin, civil and canon law, the writings of church fathers, and classical historians. She was fluent in Latin, not just familiar with it. Isabella also insisted her daughters learn domestic skills like spinning, weaving, baking, and sewing, even though they were being trained to be queens, not merchants' wives. This comprehensive education prepared Catherine not just to be Henry VIII's wife, but to be a co-ruler, which she proved herself capable of being. But most mothers couldn't provide that kind of education. For common women, teaching meant practical skills passed down through demonstration and repetition. You showed your daughter how to card wool, spin it into thread, and weave it into fabric. You taught her which plants could be used for medicine or food, which were poisonous, how to recognize when food had spoiled, how to judge the quality of grain at market. You trained her in the countless small judgments that made the difference between a household that functioned and one that struggled. You also taught your sons, though their education often shifted to their fathers or to apprenticeships once they reached a certain age. Before that, you taught them basic skills, letters if you could, prayers, and how to behave. Medieval childhood was short, but mothers were responsible for shaping those early years in ways that would determine their children's futures. All of this teaching happened while you were simultaneously working, managing your household, and possibly pregnant or nursing another child. There was no dedicated teaching time. Education was woven into daily life, learned through participation and observation. A daughter helped you bake bread and learn the process. A son followed you to market and learned to count, to judge value, to negotiate. Medieval motherhood meant being a perpetual teacher, even when you were exhausted, even when you had no formal education yourself. And then there was the shadow that hung over older mothers especially. The question of what would happen to you once you could no longer work, once your body finally gave out. In a world without social security or retirement, your children were your future. If they survived, if they thrived, they would care for you in your old age. This gave you tremendous incentive to invest in them, even at the cost of your own well-being. A mother who went hungry so her children could eat wasn't just being selfless. She was investing in her own survival. But this also created painful dynamics. Children who resented the burden of caring for aging parents. Mothers who felt they'd sacrificed everything only to be treated as obligations rather than honored elders. Medieval wills sometimes included explicit provisions requiring children to care for their widowed mothers, suggesting that such care couldn't always be assumed. The ideal was filial devotion. The reality was sometimes much messier. For women who did survive to old age and widowhood, life changed dramatically. If your husband died, you entered a period of both vulnerability and unexpected freedom. As a widow, you were legally entitled to your dower, usually 1/3 of the land your husband held during your marriage. This was enshrined in law, including in Magna Carta itself, which specified that widows should receive their inheritance and dower immediately, and without difficulty. In practice, claiming your dower could be brutally difficult. Heirs who didn't want to give up 1/3 of their inheritance might resist. In-laws who never liked you might challenge your claims. The legal system required you to fight for what was supposedly guaranteed. Many widows spent years in litigation, using courts to recover what should have been theirs by right. But if you successfully claimed your dower, you gained something medieval married women never had: legal independence. As a widow, you could own property in your own name. You could make contracts, appear in court, run businesses, and control your own life in ways that married women legally could not. Under the doctrine of coverture, a married woman's legal identity was absorbed into her husband's. You couldn't sue or be sued. You couldn't own property separately from your husband. Everything you had became his upon marriage. Widowhood ended that subjugation. Suddenly, you were a legal person again. This made widows powerful in ways that frightened medieval society. Wealthy widows, in particular, wielded enormous influence. They controlled land, commanded resources, and operated without male oversight. Some became formidable political figures. Isabel Mortimer, daughter of the first Earl of March, was appointed to the custody of her late husband's castle and held it during wartime. She married 3 times but spent long periods as a widow, and each time she demonstrated the capacity to manage estates and exercise authority that rival any male lord. Even common widows gained autonomy. You could decide whether to remarry or remain single. You could support yourself through work or property. You could make your own decisions without requiring male permission. This freedom was real, and it changed how widows moved through the world. Some chose to remarry quickly, seeking the security a husband provided. Others remained single, preferring independence to subjugation. The choice to remarry or not wasn't simple. Remarriage meant giving up your legal independence again. Your new husband would take control of your dower lands, your property, your body. You would return to the status of a legally subordinate wife. But remaining single meant managing everything yourself, which could be overwhelming, especially if you were older or in poor health. You also faced social pressure. Widows who remained single too long were sometimes viewed with suspicion, especially if they were young and attractive. The assumption was that a woman without a husband's control might become sexually or morally dangerous. Yet many widows chose independence anyway. Historical records show that 13th century widows often didn't remarry. They valued their autonomy too much. They'd spent their entire lives under male authority, first their fathers, then their husbands. Widowhood offered escape from that constant oversight. Even with its challenges, freedom was preferable to returning to subordination. As a widow, your relationship with your children might also shift. If your sons had inherited, they technically controlled the family estate, but you retained your dower rights. This created situations where mothers and sons had to negotiate, where maternal authority competed with inherited male power. Some mothers maintained strong influence over their adult children. Others found themselves marginalized, their opinions ignored, their needs minimized. Widowed mothers who had daughters faced different challenges. You wanted to secure good marriages for them, but you had limited resources to offer as dowries. If your husband had left debts, those might fall to you to resolve. If the estate was contested, you might spend years fighting for your daughter's inheritances. The work of motherhood didn't end when children reached adulthood. It simply changed forms. And through all of this, medieval mothers carried the weight of grief. Not just for children who died, though that was ever present, but grief for the life you might have had if circumstances were different. Grief for your own lost youth, spent in endless cycles of pregnancy and labor. Grief for opportunities you never had because you were born female. Medieval sources don't often record this kind of emotional pain. Women's inner lives were considered unimportant. But the grief was there, woven through the fabric of every mother's experience. Some mothers found outlets in religious devotion. The Virgin Mary became a figure many women identified with deeply. She understood childbirth, motherhood, and loss. She'd watched her son die. Praying to Mary offered comfort that male saints couldn't provide. Female saints who were mothers, like Saint Anne, offered additional models of maternal devotion and sacrifice. Other mothers found solace in female friendships and community. The networks of women who attended births, shared childcare, and supported each other through crises were lifelines. These relationships rarely appear in official records, but they were essential to survival. When historians talk about medieval society, they often focus on male relationships, military alliances, political marriages. But beneath that, there was a world of female connection that sustained daily life. The question of what medieval motherhood felt like, emotionally and psychologically, is one we can only partially answer. Women didn't write extensive personal diaries. Their letters, when they survive, were usually practical, dealing with household management or legal matters. The deep emotional core of their experiences wasn't considered worth recording. But sometimes, in miracle stories, in legal complaints, in wills and chronicles, a woman's voice breaks through clearly enough that we can hear her pain, her love, her desperation, her strength. We know medieval mothers loved their children because they fought for them. They negotiated difficult marriages to secure their futures. They endured dangerous pregnancies to give them life. They went hungry so their children could eat. They taught them everything they knew, preparing them for a world that would be just as hard for them as it had been for their mothers. This love wasn't sentimental or idealized. It was practical, fierce, and sometimes expressed in ways that seem harsh to modern sensibilities. But it was real. And medieval mothers were more than just mothers. They were workers, managing households that functioned as economic units. They were teachers, passing down essential knowledge. They were nurses, treating illness and injury with whatever remedies they had. They were negotiators, navigating complex social hierarchies to protect their families. They were survivors, enduring physical trauma that would horrify modern people. They were grievers, carrying losses that would break many of us. The popular image of medieval life often focuses on knights and battles, kings and castles, plagues and crusades. But underneath all of that, sustaining all of that, were mothers. Billions of women whose names we'll never know, who bore children in pain and danger, who raised them through poverty and uncertainty, who buried far too many of them, and who kept going anyway because stopping wasn't an option. Medieval motherhood wasn't beautiful. It wasn't empowering in any modern sense. It was brutal, dangerous, and often tragic. But it was also where life continued, where knowledge was passed down, where the next generation was shaped. Every person alive during the medieval period was shaped by a mother's hands, taught by a mother's voice, sustained by a mother's labor. We owe medieval mothers more than history has given them. We owe them recognition of their suffering, acknowledgement of their strength, and respect for their endurance. They lived in a world that gave them almost no power, almost no choice, and almost no recognition of their worth beyond their ability to produce children. And yet they loved, they fought, they survived, and they shaped the future in ways that still echo through our world today. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, think about those countless women. Think about the teenage girl terrified before her first labor. The exhausted mother nursing her fourth child while pregnant with her fifth. The grieving woman burying another baby. The widow fighting in court for her rights. The grandmother teaching her granddaughter to spin wool, passing down knowledge that stretched back generations. They lived lives of quiet heroism that no one thought to celebrate. They endured pain that no one thought to record. They made choices and sacrifices that shaped human history, even though their names don't appear in the chronicles. They were mothers in the truest, hardest sense of that word. And they deserved better than the world gave them. If you found this exploration of medieval motherhood moving or informative, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more journeys into the forgotten corners of history. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts. And maybe, just maybe, spare a thought for your own mother, your grandmother, all the women in your lineage who survived their own versions of impossible circumstances to bring you into existence. Their struggles may have been different from those of medieval women, but the core of motherhood, that fierce determination to protect and provide for your children, that spans all of human history. Good night, and sleep well.